In early 2026, NASA did something it had never done in 65 years of human spaceflight. It brought a crew home early. On the Crew 11 mission, Commander Zena Cardman and crew members from Roscosmos and JAXA boarded the SpaceX Dragon capsule Endurance and undocked from the International Space Station ahead of schedule. NASA cited a serious medical condition affecting one crew member. The nature of that condition was never disclosed, psychiatric or physiological. Nobody outside the agency knows. I've been watching videos about astronauts for as long as I can remember. I've never once stumbled across this. The more I read, the more it felt like it was being kept a secret, on purpose. NASA has a protocol for almost every emergency in space: fire, decompression, medical crisis. But there is one protocol that took 30 years to be officially acknowledged. When a journalist finally got it declassified, what was inside was not what anyone expected. 3 men drifted through the silent corridors of Skylab in late 1973. Commander Gerald Carr, science pilot Ed Gibson, and pilot Bill Pogue, each a rookie, each handpicked for resilience, entered orbit with a clear mandate: work harder, deliver more science, and prove that humans could thrive off Earth for nearly 3 months straight. The plan written in the Mission Operations Manual called for 16-hour days, experiments, equipment checks, maintenance, and endless documentation. NASA wanted every possible data point wrung from the station before its orbit decayed. But the human body and the human mind had other ideas. Within the first week, all 3 astronauts were struck by space adaptation syndrome. Nausea, disorientation. Pogue needed anti-nausea medication for days, while Carr and Gibson pushed through milder symptoms. The schedule did not slow down. Every morning a new list of tasks arrived from Houston, longer, more detailed, always urgent. The crew watched the clock, rationed their energy, and wondered if anyone below understood what it felt like to be weightless and exhausted, day after day. By late December, the tension reached a breaking point. On mission day 33, after a string of grueling spacewalks and endless experiment cycles, the crew powered down their main communications link for 8 hours. NASA's official logs called it a planned communications blackout. The real reason was simple and human. Carr, Gibson and Pogue needed a stretch of uninterrupted peace. No check-ins, no new instructions, just time to recover. The silence rattled mission control. In press accounts, the story would grow into legend, the Skylab mutiny. But the records tell a different story. There was no rebellion, no insubordination, only 3 professionals pushed to their physiological and psychological limits, negotiating for a single day off. When the comms came back, the crew requested a formal break. Alan Shepard, then chief of the astronaut office, called up and told them to protect their health first. NASA agreed to cut the workday down to 12 hours. The rest of the mission ran on that new schedule. Carr, Gibson and Pogue completed every experiment, every repair, and returned to Earth after 84 days in orbit. Not one of them ever flew in space again. The Skylab 4 incident did not end with punishment or scandal. Instead, it forced NASA to admit that even the best trained astronauts could be overwhelmed. The agency rewrote its rules for long-duration flight, adding flexibility, daily health check-ins, and a formal process for crew ground negotiations. But behind the official lessons learned, a quiet truth lingered. In space, isolation and pressure can push anyone to the edge. And if the right protocol does not exist, the consequences can spiral far beyond a missed experiment or a silent radio. For decades, the public story stopped at Skylab. Overwork, exhaustion, a negotiated day off. But in 2007, the myth of the unbreakable astronaut met a new kind of evidence. Seth Borenstein, a science reporter at the Associated Press, filed a Freedom of Information Act request that pried open NASA's medical files. What came back was not rumor or oral history. It was a pair of checklists titled Acute Psychosis and Suicidal Ideation. The Associated Press headline that day was blunt: NASA releases long-forgotten Skylab 4 crew behavior files. The documents, released as redacted PDFs, traced out a protocol that had been quietly codified in the years after Skylab. The language was clinical, but the steps were unmistakable. If an astronaut in orbit showed signs of losing touch with reality or threatened to harm themselves or others, there was a procedure. Not an emergency call to Houston, not a gentle conversation. A checklist. First, physical restraint. The instructions called for binding wrists and ankles with duct tape, chosen not for drama, but because it sticks in microgravity and it is always close at hand. Next, securing the body with bungee cords or medical straps, immobilizing the person against a bulkhead or the station's medical rack. Then, if the astronaut remained combative or unresponsive, the next step was chemical sedation, an intramuscular injection of haloperidol, Haldol, mixed with diazepam, better known as Valium. The dose was left blank in the redacted lines, but the drug names were clear. The checklist ended with a final instruction: speak calmly, maintain eye contact, explain the purpose of the restraint. There was no room for improvisation. The protocol existed, typed in black and white, stamped with NASA's internal control number, and released to the world only after a formal Freedom of Information Act appeal. For years, the idea that NASA had a secret plan for a crew member who became a danger to themselves or others sounded like science fiction. Now the evidence was public. The checklists did not just acknowledge the risk, they mapped it out, step by step. The story of astronaut resilience had a new chapter, one written not in heroics, but in contingency plans and cold, procedural language. Duct tape sits on every station inventory list, not as an afterthought, but as the first line of response. If a crew member becomes a threat to themselves or others, the checklist is clear. Wrists and ankles are bound with tape. No rope, no handcuffs. Duct tape is chosen because it grips in zero gravity and is always close by. Astronauts have used it to patch rovers and seal leaks. Here it becomes a restraint, reliable and immediate. Next, bungee cords or medical straps anchor the restrained person to a bulkhead or the medical rack. The instructions are stripped of emotion. Secure the individual. Maintain safety of flight. Each action is defined, each tool standard. There is no improvisation, only protocol. If resistance continues, the checklist turns to medication. The crew medical officer or any astronaut with basic training prepares an injection. Haloperidol, sometimes called Haldol, and diazepam, sometimes called Valium, are stored in pre-filled syringes, ready for use. The shot is delivered intramuscularly, through the flight suit, into the thigh or shoulder. The official documents redact the dose, but standard practice suggests 2 to 5 milligrams of each, enough to calm severe agitation within minutes. Throughout, one instruction repeats: speak calmly, make eye contact, explain each step, even if understanding seems lost. The flight surgeon on the ground guides the process, voice steady over the medical channel. There is no appeal, no pause. The tools are simple. The consequences are final. Authority aboard a spacecraft is not left to interpretation. Federal law, Title 14 CFR, Section 1214.702, gives the NASA mission commander sweeping authority to ensure safety and order, and even authorizes physical force if necessary. The regulation is explicit. Any action required for crew safety or spacecraft protection falls within the commander's reach. Defiance is not just a breach of protocol. Under Title 18 USC Section 799, it becomes a federal offense. On the International Space Station, the ISS Intergovernmental Agreement divides legal jurisdiction by module. but US segments remain under NASA's appointed leader. The rationale is grounded in decades of behavioral science. From Skylab's handwritten logs to ISS digital health records, evidence mounts that microgravity, sleep loss, and isolation can erode judgment and trigger agitation. NASA's 2023 evidence report on behavioral health and performance documents cognitive drift and acute psychological stress in both American and Russian crews. The protocol adapts with each mission, reflecting new findings. Commercial missions follow suit. SpaceX's Inspiration 4, launched in 2021, trained its crew for behavioral emergencies, including restraint and sedative use, procedures drawn from NASA's manuals. The language of command and last resort measures now extends beyond government missions. In 2026, Crew 11's early return, prompted by a confidential medical issue, sparked a formal review of these powers. NASA cited privacy and withheld details, but the event forced a closer look. How far should a commander's authority reach when medical needs and personal autonomy clash in orbit? The protocol endures, shaped by law and science, because in space, the chain of command is the final safeguard. Today, NASA's protocols remain classified, yet the facts are clear. Duct tape, forced sedation. Commanders are armed with federal law and physical restraint. If space can break even the best, what happens on Mars, where help cannot arrive? The silence is not just policy, it is the measure of risk we are still willing to accept.